when Vice Principal Linda Carver pointed her finger at me and shouted, "Put the envelope down." Right now, the entire hallway went silent so fast you could hear somebody's locker door slam 3 rows away. Every kid stopped walking. Every teacher looked up from whatever they were doing. And within 2 minutes, I was being escorted toward the principal's office by campus security like I'd been caught stealing from the school. Funny thing was, the only thing I was guilty of that morning was trying to make sure my son's future didn't get lost under somebody else's paperwork. My name is Marcus Hayes, and for nearly 7 years I worked as the head custodian at Brookfield High School, just outside Columbus, Ohio. I wasn't the kind of person students usually remembered by name, but they knew my face. I was the guy fixing a classroom door before first period started, replacing broken light bulbs during lunch, cleaning up after football games while everyone else was already home with their families. I knew which hallway floor squeaked after it rained, which science lab sink always backed up every November, and which sophomore would forget his backpack at least twice a week. You spend enough years taking care of a building, and eventually it starts feeling less like a workplace and more like an old friend that constantly needs help standing up straight. Most people walk past me without thinking much about it, and honestly, that was fine with me. My father used to tell me, "Son, if people only notice your work when something goes wrong, then you're probably doing your job right." I carried that sentence with me every single morning. I got to school before sunrise, made a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, unlocked service closets, checked boilers during winter, and quietly disappeared into the background while teachers got the credit for another successful school day. That life suited me just fine, because I had something a whole lot more important waiting for me at home. My son, Ethan. Most people at Brookfield had absolutely no idea he was my kid, and that wasn't some accident. That was my decision. Ethan was a junior, straight-A student, captain of the robotics club, one of those quiet kids who worked twice as hard as everybody else because he never wanted anyone handing him sympathy. Years earlier, when he first started high school, I sat him down at our little kitchen table and asked him one question. "Do you want people knowing I'm your dad?" He looked at me for a long minute before answering. "Dad, I don't mind what you do. I'm proud of you. I just don't want teachers thinking I need special treatment. And I definitely don't want kids saying I only get opportunities because my father works here." That answer hit me harder than he ever realized. I smiled, told him I understood, and from that day on we kept our relationship quiet. At school, I called him Mr. Hayes if anyone was around. He called me Sir. We never ate lunch together. We never rode home together. If I happened to pass him in the hallway, maybe I'd give him a little nod. Nothing more. Sometimes that hurt more than I'd ever admit. But watching him earn every single achievement with nobody knowing whose son he was, that made every sacrifice worth it. The night before everything happened, I came home exhausted after staying late to help clean the gym after a community fundraiser. Our mailbox had one oversized white envelope tucked between grocery ads and electric bills. It had Brookfield High's logo printed across the top corner. At first I figured it was another schedule change or maybe something about senior planning. But the second I opened it and saw the words, "Congratulations," my hands actually started shaking. I sat down before I even finished reading because I couldn't believe what I was looking at. 4-year academic scholarship, $38,000. Renewable each year. I read Ethan's name 3 times just to make sure my tired eyes weren't playing tricks on me. I wanted to wake him up right then, but it was almost midnight and he'd fallen asleep over his chemistry notes at the dining room table. I just stood there looking at him for a while, thinking about every extra shift I'd worked, every birthday gift I'd postponed buying myself, every pair of boots I'd worn 6 months longer than I should have because college wasn't some abstract dream anymore. It had become real. The letter explained there would be a recognition ceremony the following afternoon, but something about the paperwork bothered me. There were additional forms attached, and I knew exactly how school offices could get during busy weeks. Papers got buried. Folders disappeared. Somebody forgot to call somebody else. Maybe I worried too much after spending years watching chaos unfold behind the scenes, but I kept thinking about that envelope sitting on a cluttered desk somewhere while everyone rushed around preparing for graduation season. So I made a decision. I'd bring it with me before my shift started, hand it directly to the principal's office, make sure nothing delayed my son's moment, and then quietly disappear back to replacing ceiling tiles like any other Tuesday. Looking back now, that's the moment where everything began to fall apart. I parked a little earlier than usual, tucked the envelope carefully under my arm, and walked through the front entrance. The morning rush had already started. Students laughed their way down the hall, Teachers balanced coffee cups and laptops. Announcements echoed faintly through the speakers. I had almost reached the administrative office when I heard a sharp voice behind me. Marcus? What's in that envelope? I turned and saw Vice Principal Linda Carver staring directly at me. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't curious. She had already decided something was wrong. I answered as calmly as I could. Just something that needs to get to Principal Bennett personally. She stepped closer. Give it to me. I tightened my grip without even thinking. I'd rather hand it to him myself. Ma'am, her eyes narrowed immediately. Why? What's so important that administration can't see it? Kids had already started slowing down to watch. My heart sank because I knew exactly how this looked, but I also knew I had promised myself that letter would reach the right hands untouched. With respect, I said quietly, I'd really prefer Principal Bennett open it himself. Linda's voice got louder. Marcus, put the envelope down. Right now. The hallway froze. I could feel dozens of eyes burning into the back of my neck, and before I even had another chance to explain, someone reached for a radio and called security. Security officers Tom Willis and Kevin Monroe arrived so quickly it almost felt rehearsed, not because either one of them thought I was dangerous. I could see that in their faces, but because when someone from administration sounds convinced enough over the radio, people stop asking questions and start following procedures. Tom looked at me with the same expression he'd worn every Friday for years when we'd shared bad coffee in the maintenance garage before football games. Marcus, he said quietly, almost apologetically, would you mind coming with us? I glanced down at the envelope for a second before answering. I'll walk. I wasn't about to make a scene. I'd spent 7 years helping keep that school running, and I wasn't going to become the reason students remembered a fight in the hallway. So I nodded, adjusted the envelope under my arm, and followed them while 200 teenagers watched from both sides of the corridor. That was the part that hurt the most. Not Linda's accusation, not security walking beside me. It was seeing kids I'd watched grow up whispering to each other, trying to figure out what the janitor had done. One freshman I'd helped after he slipped on an icy sidewalk looked like he wanted to say something, but his friend grabbed his backpack and pulled him away. Nobody wants to stand next to the person everyone suddenly thinks is guilty. That's just human nature. We reached the administrative office, and Principal Daniel Bennett was already standing beside his desk. Unlike Linda, he wasn't angry. He looked confused. Marcus, he said, I've never had security escort you anywhere before. I managed a small smile. Neither have I. Linda stepped in before another word could be spoken. He refused to surrender school property, acted suspiciously, and insisted only you could see whatever's inside that envelope. I recommend immediate suspension until we determine whether confidential student records have been compromised. Bennett didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked directly at me. Is that what happened? I shook my head. No. Sir, then tell me what's going on. I stared at the envelope for several seconds. Part of me wanted to explain everything right there, but another part remembered the promise I'd silently made to Ethan years ago. His accomplishments belonged to him, not to me. If I suddenly announced he was my son because it would save me from embarrassment, what kind of father would that make me? So I answered the only way I could. I'd rather you open it yourself. Linda threw both hands into the air. See? He's still refusing to cooperate. Bennett held up one finger without even looking at her. Marcus, may I? I nodded and carefully placed the envelope on his desk. The room went completely silent except for the faint buzzing of fluorescent lights overhead. Bennett slid one finger beneath the flap, unfolded the papers inside, and started reading. I watched his expression change before he said a single word. First confusion, then surprise, then something close to disbelief. He flipped to the second page, looked back at the first, and quietly read one sentence again under his breath. Finally, he looked up. $38,000. Nobody moved. 4-year academic scholarship. Linda frowned. What? Bennett slowly turned the first page around so everyone could see the school letterhead. This is a scholarship award. She blinked twice. For who? He looked back down. Ethan Hayes. The room stayed quiet. Linda crossed her arms. I don't know that student. Bennett admitted. Neither do I. Right then there was another knock on the office door. Sorry to interrupt, said Michael Ross, the English department chair, stepping halfway inside with his tablet still in his hand. I heard there was some kind of misunderstanding involving Marcus. Bennett looked up. Michael, do we have an Ethan Hayes? Of course we do. He opened the student database almost automatically. Junior. Honor roll every semester. Robotics team. National Merit Semi-Finalist. Volunteers at the public library. He stopped talking the second the student photograph appeared on the screen. Then his eyes slowly drifted from the tablet to me. Wait, he whispered. Marcus? I already knew what question was coming. He's your son? I nodded once. Nobody said anything for several long seconds. Linda looked back and forth between my face and the screen like she'd somehow missed 600 obvious clues over the last 3 years. Why would you hide that? She asked. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It sounded almost genuine. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath I'd been holding since breakfast, because I didn't want anyone giving him anything he didn't earn. Michael lowered the tablet onto Bennett's desk. You mean nobody knew? Very few people outside my family. Bennett folded his hands together. Marcus, explain it to us. I looked through the office window toward the hallway where students were still changing classes, then began telling a story I'd never expected to tell inside that building. When Ethan started here, I asked him if he wanted people knowing I worked at the school. He told me he was proud of me, but he didn't want teachers feeling sorry for him. And he didn't want classmates assuming every good grade came because his dad knew people in the office. So we agreed we keep work and family separate. Michael shook his head slowly. That's why you two never spoke in public. Exactly. Bennett suddenly remembered dozens of little moments. I've seen him walk right past you. He was supposed to. You called him Mr. Hayes. He called me sir. Even during football games, I smiled. Especially during football games. Linda's expression had changed completely. The certainty she'd carried all morning had disappeared, replaced by something much heavier. She looked down at the floor before asking quietly, and the letter? It came to my house last night. I worried somebody might misplace the paperwork before today's ceremony. I figured if I handed it directly to you before my shift started, everything would stay on schedule. Bennett leaned back in his chair and rubbed both hands across his face. So, let me understand this correctly. You came in early, not because you were hiding school documents, but because you were protecting your son's scholarship? Sir, and you never once told anyone he was your son because you wanted him judged on his own work? Yes, sir. Nobody spoke. There wasn't anything left to say. The silence itself carried more weight than another speech ever could. Finally, Linda inhaled slowly. Marcus. Her voice cracked just enough that everyone heard it. I owe you an apology. I looked at her for a moment before answering. You don't owe me one because you embarrassed me. You owe every student out there one if they saw how quickly an assumption became a public accusation. That sentence landed harder than I intended, not because I wanted revenge, but because once words leave your mouth in front of children, you can't take them back. Bennett stood up. Linda, cancel whatever meetings you have this afternoon. She looked up. Why? Because we're holding staff training before this day ends. Today? Today. His voice wasn't angry. It was firm. If one of the most trusted employees in this building can be publicly judged without a single question being asked first, then we have a bigger problem than a misunderstanding. Michael quietly nodded in agreement. Tom and Kevin, the two security officers who had remained near the doorway, looked visibly uncomfortable. Tom finally spoke. Marcus, I'm sorry. I smiled at him. You were doing your job. Still doesn't feel good. No, I admitted. It doesn't. Bennett walked around his desk until he stood directly in front of me. Then, in front of everyone, he extended both hands instead of one. I stood up and shook them. It wasn't some dramatic movie moment. Nobody clapped. Nobody cried. It was simply one man silently acknowledging another man's dignity after it had almost been taken away. And somehow, that meant even more. Bennett looked me in the eyes and said, You protected your son's future and his integrity. I don't know many parents who would have had the strength to stay silent all these years. I laughed softly. Trust me, it wasn't easy. Does Ethan know what happened this morning? I smiled. I hope not. Bennett looked toward the scholarship letter one more time before carefully sliding it back into the envelope. Let's make sure the only thing he remembers today is walking across that stage. At that moment, the school bell rang outside. Students poured through the hallways again, and none of us realized that before the afternoon was over, the biggest lesson taught inside Brookfield High wouldn't come from any classroom. It would come from a quiet custodian who reminded every adult in the building that respect should never depend on a job title. 2 hours later, the auditorium looked exactly like it always did on scholarship day. Polished floors, proud families filling every row, teachers dressed a little nicer than usual, cameras already pointed toward the stage. And if you had walked in at that moment, you never would have guessed the strangest morning in Brookfield High's recent history had unfolded only a few hallways away. I changed back into my gray work gloves after leaving the principal's office because there was still a leaking faucet in the science wing that wasn't going to fix itself. And somehow that felt right. Life doesn't stop just because your heart has been turned inside out for a couple of hours. Around lunchtime, Principal Bennett found me replacing ceiling tiles near the cafeteria. He didn't say much, just handed me a visitor's badge and smiled. "I'd like you to sit in the audience today." I looked down at the badge before handing it back. "I already have the best seat in the building." He frowned. "Which one is that?" I pointed toward the rear entrance of the auditorium. "Back there. Nobody notices the custodian sitting in the last row." He chuckled, but he didn't argue. Maybe by then, he understood that I'd spent years staying out of the spotlight on purpose. When the ceremony started, I slipped quietly through the back doors and took the very last seat beside the sound booth. A few parents nodded politely without recognizing me. A little girl sitting with her grandmother smiled and waved because she'd seen me fixing drinking fountains before. I waved back. That's all I needed. Student after student walked across the stage collecting awards while families cheered. But my heart didn't really start pounding until I heard the announcer pause for just a second before saying, "This year's Academic Excellence Scholarship recipient, Ethan Hayes." The applause started immediately, then somehow kept growing louder. Ethan stood up, adjusted his tie the way he always did when he was nervous, and walked toward the stage with that same calm expression he'd carried his entire life. Watching him in that moment, nobody would have guessed how many evenings he'd spent studying at our tiny kitchen table while I worked overtime, or how many weekends we'd fixed old laptops together because buying a new one wasn't in the budget. Nobody would have known that every success he earned had been built on thousands of ordinary days that never made headlines. Principal Bennett shook Ethan's hand, handed him the scholarship certificate, then leaned over and whispered something that made my son smile for just a second before he looked toward the back of the auditorium. Our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds. That was it. No dramatic wave, no pointing, no public announcement that the janitor in the last row was his father. He simply gave the smallest nod imaginable, the kind only family would recognize, and I answered with one of my own. Somehow that tiny exchange meant more than standing beside him on stage ever could have. After the ceremony ended, families crowded around taking pictures while teachers congratulated students. I stayed where I was until most of the room had emptied. Then I quietly headed back toward the maintenance hallway, figuring I'd let Ethan enjoy his moment without me hovering nearby. Before I reached the service door, I heard footsteps running behind me. "Dad!" I turned around just in time for Ethan to wrap me in the biggest hug he'd given me since he was probably 12 years old. "Mr. Bennett told me everything," he said, laughing and crying at the same time. "You actually got escorted by security because of my scholarship?" I shrugged. "Well, sounds a little ridiculous when you say it like that." He pulled back, looked me straight in the eye, and said something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. "You spent years making sure nobody saw what you sacrificed for me. Today they finally did." I couldn't answer right away. Some moments are simply too full for words. Principal Bennett and Michael Ross walked over a minute later, giving us just enough space before Bennett smiled and said, "Marcus, I think it's time this school learned something from you." A week later, every administrator and department head attended mandatory training on unconscious bias, respectful communication, and the danger of making conclusions before asking questions. Principal Bennett never mentioned my name publicly, but everyone knew why the training happened. As for Linda Carver, she surprised me the most. She came to my workshop one afternoon carrying 2 cups of coffee. She didn't make excuses. She didn't blame stress or deadlines or misunderstanding. She simply looked at me and said, "I forgot that uniforms tell us what someone does, not who they are." I accepted the coffee. "We all forget sometimes," I replied. "The important part is remembering before the next person gets hurt." We never became close friends, but we learned how to respect each other. And sometimes that's the better ending anyway, because real life isn't about villains suddenly becoming heroes. It's about people choosing to be a little better than they were yesterday. Looking back now, I don't remember the embarrassment nearly as much as I remember that quiet nod from the back of the auditorium. That's the memory that stayed with me, not the accusation, not the security escort, just a father watching his son earn something the right way. And maybe that's why I wanted to tell this story, because every school, every workplace, every neighborhood has a Marcus. Someone doing honest work that most people never notice until they're suddenly standing in the middle of a misunderstanding they never asked for. So here's what I'd love to know from you. If you had been standing in that hallway that morning, would you have questioned what everyone else assumed? Or would you have stayed silent and watched it happen? Let me know down in the comments, because conversations like this matter. Share the story with someone who believes every person deserves respect, no matter what job they do. And if you enjoy stories about justice, character, and the quiet moments that restore your faith in people, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, because we've got plenty more real-life inspired stories waiting for you.